The sun had already dropped below the Texas horizon, leaving the sky bruised with streaks of purple and fading orange. The kind of evening that wrapped a small town in silence, broken only by the hum of cicadas and the flickering neon open sign outside Carter's Fuel and Deli. The gas station sat at the edge of nowhere, its cracked asphalt lot catching the glow of a single overhead lamp. Inside, Elena Carter moved quietly behind the counter. 39 years old, she carried herself with a beauty that had nothing to do with makeup or style. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, a few strands falling across her face. Her eyes, once sharp hazel, were now clouded, the milky scars of combat trauma that had stolen her sight. To the unknowing, she might have looked fragile, misplaced behind the cash register of a dusty gas station. But there was something about her posture, the straightness of her back, the way her hands moved with practiced precision, that suggested she was anything but ordinary. At her feet lay Shadow, a German Shepherd Malinois mix whose ears twitched at every sound, whose amber eyes tracked every movement. To Elena, he was more than a dog. He was her partner, her protector, her eyes in the darkness she could no longer fully see. Shadow had served with her overseas, trained to detect explosives, to track enemies, to guard lives. Now, in this quiet outpost of Texas, he guarded her. Elena reached for the stack of receipts, fingers tracing the edges before sliding them neatly into place. She didn't need her sight to know where everything belonged. Years of training had taught her how to operate by memory, by instinct. The rhythm of the gas station, the steady hum of coolers, the occasional ring of the front door bell, was a kind of peace she had built for herself after the chaos of war. But peace never lasts. It began as a faint rumble in the distance, so low that only Shadow noticed at first. His ears perked, his muscles tensed. A moment later, Elena felt the vibration through the floor, like distant thunder rolling closer. Then came the roar, deep, guttural, metallic, as 6 Harley-Davidson engines tore into the night, shattering the fragile quiet of the station. Shadow growled low, pressing closer to her leg. Elena's hands froze mid-motion. She didn't need her eyes to recognize the sound of trouble. She had heard engines like that before, engines that always carried men who believed volume equaled power, that fear could be manufactured through noise and presence. Through the grimy glass windows, headlights slashed across the lot. 6 massive motorcycles swung into formation, circling before stopping in front of the pumps. Their chrome gleamed under the fluorescent lights, adorned with the painted emblem of the Blood Vultures, a gang infamous across Texas highways. At the head of the pack sat Rex Dalton. He was enormous, 6'3" at least, with shoulders like a bull and a black beard streaked with gray that fell against his leather vest. Tattoos climbed his arms, curling up his neck and disappearing beneath his jaw. His reputation traveled ahead of him. Ex-convict, brawler, leader of a gang that thrived on intimidation. Rex wasn't just dangerous. He enjoyed being dangerous. The engines cut off one by one, leaving a heavy silence that seemed to press into the store's thin walls. Elena's fingers found the edge of the counter, steadying herself. Her heart quickened, but her breathing stayed calm, even. She had faced worse. Still, her body remembered what her mind didn't want to admit. Trouble had arrived. The bell above the door shrieked as Rex shoved it open. The glass rattled in its frame. His boots hit the linoleum floor with a weight that echoed through the small store. Behind him, 2 bikers lingered at the door, while the others spread out like wolves circling prey. Rex's eyes swept the store, landing on Elena behind the counter. He grinned, a predator's grin, hungry and cruel. "Beer," he barked, his voice a gravely rasp that carried years of smoke and whiskey. 2 cases, and fill up all 6 tanks outside. Elena lifted her chin slightly, though her clouded eyes didn't meet his. She nodded once. "Stay calm. Stay quiet." "Yes, sir," she said evenly. Her voice was soft, polite, but steady. She moved a step away from the counter. Rex shot out. Calloused fingers clamped around her shirt, tugging her back with brute force. His touch was rough, the kind of grab that left no room for misunderstanding. Shadow leapt to his feet, lips curled, teeth bared in a warning growl that vibrated in the air. Rex ignored the dog. He was used to being the biggest threat in any room. He pulled harder, fabric straining under his grip. "Hold up," he muttered, leaning close enough that she could smell the stale mix of sweat, tobacco, and motor oil on him. "What's a blind little thing like you doing here all alone?" Elena stiffened, but said nothing. Silence, she had learned long ago, could be stronger than words. The other bikers began to chuckle, the kind of laughter that fed off cruelty. One of them pulled out his phone, holding it up to record. Their followers online would love this, the big bad blood vultures scaring some helpless woman at a gas station. But Elena wasn't helpless. Rex's grip tightened, and with a sudden jerk he tore at her shirt. The fabric ripped down the front with a harsh sound, echoing in the stillness of the store. The laughter faltered. For a second, even the bikers froze at the violence of the act. Elena gasped softly, instinctively clutching the torn cloth to her chest. Shadow barked, a sharp, explosive sound that filled the room with danger. His teeth snapped inches from Rex's arm, restrained only by Elena's quiet command under her breath. "Stay." The room went dead silent. Rex's grin widened, cruel and mocking, but beneath it flickered something else, curiosity. He expected fear, tears, begging, but the woman in front of him wasn't crumbling. Her face was calm, her chin lifted, her body steady despite the ragged shirt hanging from her frame. For the first time that night, Rex Dalton felt a ripple of unease crawl up his spine. And outside, in the shadows of the parking lot, the blood vulture's engines ticked as they cooled, like the quiet countdown to a storm that was only just beginning. For a split second, Elena staggered back, her hand instinctively clutching the torn edge of her shirt. The world around her was a blur of shapes and shadows, a haze she had lived with for nearly a decade. But what she lacked in sight, she compensated with awareness sharpened by fire and loss. Every breath in the store was accounted for, every scrape of leather against linoleum, every faint shift of boots on tile. She did not need perfect vision to know where the danger stood. Shadow sensed it before anyone else. With a sudden, guttural growl, he surged forward just enough to plant himself between Elena and Rex, his hackles raised, teeth gleaming under the buzzing fluorescent lights. His body was taut, a wall of muscle and loyalty, daring anyone to take another step closer. Rex smirked at the display, his laugh low and cruel. "A blind woman working the night shift?" he jeered, leaning back as though the very sight of her condition amused him. "What a joke! Who hired you? Who thought you could handle anything out here?" His words echoed through the narrow aisles, bouncing off shelves lined with dusty chip bags and soda bottles. One of the younger bikers snorted, trying to hold back his own laughter, his phone still raised, recording. To them, this was entertainment, mockery packaged for the amusement of strangers online. But Elena didn't flinch. Her shoulders remained squared, her feet planted firmly. Years of military drills had left their imprint, habits etched so deeply into her body that even blindness could not erase them. The stance she took was subtle, knees bent just slightly, weight balanced, chin lifted with quiet defiance. It was the posture of a Marine, not a victim. Shadow's growl deepened, vibrating like a warning bell. Elena placed a calming hand on his head, fingers pressing lightly against his fur, steadying both him and herself. "It's all right," she murmured, her voice soft but commanding, the kind of voice that once cut through chaos and gunfire. The words unsettled the bikers. They had expected pleading, maybe tears. They had expected a trembling voice begging them to stop. Instead, they were met with composure that bordered on unnerving. One of the younger men, barely in his 20s, shifted uncomfortably. His gaze flicked from Rex to Elena, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. He saw something the others were too blinded by arrogance to notice. It wasn't the weakness of a disabled woman. It was the eerie calm of someone who had been tested by fire and had walked away scarred but unbroken. Rex didn't like it. He thrived on fear, on the way people wilted under his presence. But the woman in front of him, half blind, her shirt ripped, stood her ground as though the room belonged to her. It was a silent defiance that cut deeper than any shouted insult. "You think standing up straight makes you tough?" Rex barked, leaning closer, his breath hot and sour. "I've seen bigger men crumble when I get in their face. What makes you so calm, huh? Don't you realize how this ends?" Elena tilted her head toward his voice. Though her eyes could no longer track him, her expression carried something he hadn't seen in years, absolute composure. "I've been through worse," she said quietly. The sentence hung in the air like smoke, heavy and undeniable. Behind Rex, another biker shifted, the nervous one from earlier. His gaze caught the faint shimmer of dog tags half hidden beneath the torn fabric of Elena's shirt. His mouth went dry. That wasn't jewelry from a mall kiosk, and he knew it. His older brother had served, and he'd seen those tags enough times to know what they meant. He lowered his phone without realizing it, his stomach tightening with unease. Shadow's tail was stiff, his entire body quivering with the readiness to strike. Every muscle waited on Elena's word. He wasn't posturing. He was promising violence if she gave the command. The bikers laughed less now. The store suddenly felt smaller, the buzzing of the old neon sign outside strangely louder in the silence that followed. Rex forced another sneer, masking the unease creeping into his chest. He jabbed a finger toward Elena's face, so close Shadow snapped his jaws just inches away. "You can't even see me," Rex mocked. "How are you going to stop me if I decide to?" Elena cut him off, not with words, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that spoke louder than noise, the kind soldiers carried after surviving things no one else could imagine. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't pleading. She was calculating. And somehow, the blind woman behind the counter made Rex Dalton feel like the one who had miscalculated. For the first time, the younger bikers noticed the difference between appearance and reality. This wasn't a helpless clerk. This was someone carved by war, a figure who carried herself like a storm barely contained. They glanced at one another, uneasy, as though realizing they might have stepped into something far greater than the intimidation game they thought they were playing. Rex scowled, furious at the shift in the room, at the way control seemed to slip through his hands. His grip on power had always been built on spectacle, noise, fear, and dominance. But what happens when the person in front of you refuses to break? What happens when the one you mock refuses to play the role of victim? The answer was beginning to form in the uneasy silence. The hunter becomes the fool, and the blind woman isn't helpless at all. Rex's second yank was cruel, fueled by the kind of arrogance that had carried him through years of domination. The fabric didn't just strain this time, it gave way entirely. The tear was sharp, final, leaving Elena's chest exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. And there it was. A tattoo stretched across her skin, etched in black and steel-gray ink that had weathered years of wear and scar tissue. The words Semper Fidelis curved above the unmistakable emblem of the United States Marine Corps, the eagle, globe, and anchor. Just below, a pale scar slashed diagonally from her shoulder down across her collarbone, a wound that hadn't just brushed her, but had tried to claim her life. The room froze. For a heartbeat, the entire gang stared as if the air had been sucked out of the building. The mocking laughter that had filled the gas station only minutes before died in their throats. Even the buzzing of the neon sign outside seemed to quiet. Shadow did not hesitate. The ripping sound was all the trigger he needed. With a growl that vibrated like thunder, he launched forward, his body a blur of muscle and fur. His jaws clamped onto Rex's forearm with brutal precision, the exact strike he had been trained to execute in war zones. Teeth sank deep, not to kill but to disable, to control. Rex roared, stumbling back. His knees buckled as Shadow's weight drove him off balance, the leather of his vest creaking as he hit the edge of the counter. Pain shot up his arm, his face twisting in shock and rage. "Get him off me!" Rex bellowed, his voice cracking into something that sounded more like fear than fury. But none of his men moved. The younger bikers stood wide-eyed, their phones now lowered, forgotten in their hands. The bravado they had carried into the store had drained, replaced by something they hadn't felt in years. Hesitation. They weren't staring at Shadow. They weren't even staring at Rex. Their eyes were fixed on Elena, on the tattoo inked into her chest, on the scar carved into her skin, on the posture of a woman who didn't shrink even after being exposed. It wasn't just ink. It was history. It was service. It was a mark you didn't buy or steal. You earned it with blood. Rex's gaze flicked down to her chest again, then back up to her steady, clouded eyes. His bravado cracked like thin glass. His voice, rough and broken, slipped out in disbelief. "No way," he whispered, his breath uneven. You were a Marine?" Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any confirmation. Her stillness spoke of memory, of nights in burning sand, of brothers and sisters in arms who never came home. Shadow held his grip firm but measured, his growl low and steady as if he too understood this was more than a fight for survival. It was revelation. One of the older bikers, the one with graying hair and weathered skin, took a half step forward, his voice rough but trembling with recognition. "I've seen scars like that," he muttered, almost to himself. "Fallujah, the market bombing, Jesus Christ." Elena's head turned slightly at the word, the faintest acknowledgement. Shadow tightened his jaws just enough to make Rex grunt in pain, then loosened again, waiting for her signal. The discipline was uncanny. He wasn't attacking blindly. He was guarding, controlling, holding the line, just like he had in the deserts years ago. Rex tried to pull back, but Shadow's weight and precision pinned him. He looked at Elena again, his arrogance unraveling with each second he studied her face. For years, he had thrived on intimidation. But the woman standing in front of him, half-blind, shirt-torn, scars bared, radiated a power that dwarfed his own. The silence in the store grew heavy. Each biker stood caught between disbelief and shame. They had thought they were humiliating a helpless clerk, just another victim to parade online. But what they had uncovered instead was something untouchable. Not weakness, not pity, honor. Elena finally spoke, her voice calm and measured, carrying the weight of someone who had once shouted commands through gunfire. "Shadow, hold." The dog's growl eased, but his teeth stayed firm against Rex's arm. She lifted her chin, the faintest ghost of authority flickering through her posture. "You asked what makes me calm," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "This. I've already walked through hell." Rex swallowed hard, his bravado drained. The smirk was gone, replaced by something far rarer in his world, respect edged with fear. He glanced at the tattoo again, at the scar, and for the first time in years, the leader of the Blood Vultures felt small. The gang that had ridden into the night looking for entertainment now stood frozen, realizing they had stumbled into the story of someone they couldn't possibly measure against. And as Shadow held Rex trembling under his bite, the truth settled over them like a weight none of them could shake. The blind woman wasn't just a survivor. She was a Marine, and nothing in their world of noise and intimidation could compete with that. The store was silent except for Shadow's low rumble, a sound that vibrated through the linoleum floor and into the bones of every man in the room. His jaws stayed clamped around Rex's arm, controlled but merciless, holding the gang leader in a humiliating bind. The rest of the Blood Vultures stood frozen, their swagger stripped away. And then one of them moved. He was older, his leather vest worn and sun-faded, his beard flecked with gray. He took a cautious step forward, his eyes not on Shadow, not on Rex, but on Elena. His voice cracked as if the words dragged themselves out of some hidden chamber of memory. "I know those scars," he whispered, shaking his head like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Fallujah, 2010, the market bombing." The name alone was enough to pull the air out of the room. Fallujah. The very word carried ghosts. Men in uniform still woke up in the middle of the night with its echoes rattling in their heads. The sound of mortars, the chaos of crowds, the choking smoke. Everyone in that store who had worn a patch of service, whether they admitted it or not, felt their stomachs twist at the mention. Elena didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was confirmation enough. Shadow pressed closer to her leg, teeth still locked on Rex, his growl steady. The animal seemed to understand what was unraveling, seemed to sense that this was no longer just about intimidation in a gas station. This was about recognition. Revelation. Rex's face drained of color. For the first time since he had walked into the store, his bravado cracked beyond repair. His eyes, hard and cruel moments earlier, now widened, and a sheen of sweat broke across his forehead. He wasn't seeing Elena the clerk anymore. He wasn't even seeing Elena the blind woman. He was seeing something else, a memory, the inferno, the choking heat of burning fuel, the sound of screaming Marines trapped in the wreckage of Humvees. The market bombing had been chaos designed by men who knew exactly how to trap and destroy. And in the middle of it, through smoke, through blood, through the blinding sandstorm of debris, there had been a figure. He remembered it now with a clarity that shook him. A female Marine, small in frame but unstoppable, dragging bodies through fire with a strength born of desperation. Her eyes had already been injured, blood and smoke streaming down her face. Half blind, but she never stopped moving. He had seen her stagger, seen her fall to one knee, only to rise again and keep pulling men out of hell. Soldiers whispered her call sign afterward. Not shouted, not written in reports, whispered, like something sacred. Hawkeye. Rex's lips moved, almost soundless at first, as though he couldn't believe the words he was speaking. No, shaking his head, his arms still pinned in Shadow's jaws. No, it can't be. Hawkeye. They said she was gone. They said she didn't make it out. Elena stood motionless, her chin lifted slightly, her torn shirt exposing the ink and scars that told a story she had tried so hard to bury. Her clouded eyes gave nothing away, but the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her shoulders, spoke volumes. She wasn't denying it. She couldn't. The older biker's face was pale, his breath uneven. He had served once, maybe not with her, but close enough to know the legends that lived in whispered stories passed around VA halls and veteran bars. He remembered a firefight that lasted hours, Marines who swore a half-blind woman had held the line while others bled out. Rex remembered too. The night replayed behind his eyes like a nightmare dragged into daylight. The Humvee flipped by the blast, the searing fire that ate oxygen until every breath was a battle. He remembered thinking it was over, that no one was coming, and then she appeared, through fire, through dust, through death itself. She had dragged him by the vest, coughing and half-blind, into cover. He had begged her to leave him, his leg twisted and useless, but she refused. He remembered her words, not loud, not dramatic, just iron. No one. And then, like a ghost, she had vanished back into the flames. His knees trembled now, nearly giving out as he stared at her. Hawkeye. The ghost he had convinced himself was a figment of smoke and trauma. Standing here in front of him, alive. Elena's silence was heavier than any accusation. She didn't claim the name. She didn't remind him of what she'd done. She simply stood there, Shadow guarding her, her scars bared. And in that silence, every man in the room felt the weight of truth. The young biker who had been recording slowly lowered his phone, his hands shaking. His face was pale as realization sank in. He hadn't been filming a stunt, a prank, an easy scare. He had been recording the humiliation of a Marine hero, someone his own father might have spoken of with reverence. The shame made his stomach twist. Rex's voice broke completely, the words barely making it past his throat. "They called you Hawkeye," he whispered, his arm trembling in Shadow's grip. "I thought you were dead. I thought you died that night." Elena's lips pressed together, her breath steady. For a moment, she seemed carved from stone. But deep inside, his words struck something she had fought for years to keep buried. Memories she couldn't erase, men screaming her name, her hands slipping on blood, the world going dark as she staggered out of the blast radius. Shadow let out another low growl, pulling her back to the present. She laid her hand lightly on his head, grounding herself. She finally spoke, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Dead or alive doesn't matter. What matters is who made it home." The words cut through Rex like a blade. His chest heaved, his eyes burning with the weight of 11 years of guilt and unspoken gratitude. His men shifted uneasily, the swagger of outlaws giving way to the shame of men who had misjudged, who had mocked someone who deserved reverence. The gas station was no longer just a pit stop in the night. It had become something else, a battlefield of memory, where ghosts long buried had risen to confront the living, and at the center of it stood Elena Carter, Hawkeye, half-blind, scarred, and unshaken. The past had found her, and no one in that store would ever see her the same again. The sound of leather scraping against the linoleum was sharp and jarring as Rex's knees hit the floor. It wasn't a graceful act of surrender, but a collapse, the body of a man buckling under the weight of memory and truth. His arm still throbbed from Shadow's jaws, and the blood that trickled down was nothing compared to the humiliation pouring through his veins. The Blood Vultures, the same gang that had strutted in like kings of the road, shifted in stunned silence. Their leader, their unstoppable force, was kneeling. The swagger that had filled the store only minutes earlier had evaporated. They no longer looked like predators. They looked like boys who had been caught misbehaving, stripped bare of the armor arrogance had given them. Shadow kept his teeth pressed against her arm until Elena's voice cut clean through the tension. Calm, steady, a tone forged in fire. "Shadow, release!" The command was soft but absolute. The dog obeyed instantly, loosening his grip, stepping back, but never leaving her side. He stayed pressed against her leg, his chest rumbling with a low, steady growl, daring anyone to test his loyalty again. Rex's body trembled as he clutched his injured arm to his chest. He looked up at her, and for the first time in years, there was no malice in his eyes. No mockery, only recognition. "You?" His voice cracked. The sound was raw, stripped of bravado. "You pulled me out of that burning truck. I owe you my life." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable. Elena didn't move. Her clouded eyes, scarred and distant, gave him nothing. She stood tall despite her torn shirt, the tattoo and scar still visible, silent proof of everything she had endured. Shadow pressed closer, his warmth steadying her against the storm of memory swirling in the room. The younger bikers looked at one another, eyes wide, shame gnawing at their guts. They had come to laugh, to record humiliation, to post a clip of cruelty online. Instead, they had witnessed their leader confessing a debt no man could repay. One of them whispered under his breath, "Holy God," and tucked his phone into his pocket as though even holding it had become a sin. The older biker, the one who had recognized Fallujah, nodded slowly as though he had expected this moment. His face was grave, his voice reverent. "She's Hawkeye, the one they said didn't make it out. I told you, only someone like her could stand like that." Rex shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "They told me you were dead. For years I carried that. Thought the one who saved me burned in that fire. I built my life on guilt, thinking your sacrifice was the price for my survival." His voice broke again. The gang shifted uneasily, not used to seeing their leader stripped bare of his mask. But the truth was undeniable. In that gas station, the hierarchy of power had flipped completely. Elena finally spoke, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through his unraveling. "You don't owe me," she said. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because it was my job. No one gets left behind." Her words weren't cruel, but they carried a weight heavier than any accusation. They were a reminder, not of his weakness, but of her creed. Rex bowed his head, unable to meet her eyes. His chest heaved as if he were carrying every ghost from that day, every scream, every flash of fire. The gang behind him, hardened men who had beaten rivals into the dirt and stared down cops without blinking, now stood in reverent silence. For years they had worshipped Rex as a figure of dominance, a man who bent the world to his will. But tonight, in the middle of a rundown gas station, they saw him brought to his knees, not by fists, not by force, but by truth, by a blind woman and her dog. Shadow shifted, sensing the change. His growl faded into silence, but his stance remained protective. Elena laid a hand gently on his head, grounding herself as much as him. Her fingers trembled faintly, though her voice never wavered. "You lived," she said finally, her tone softening. "That's what matters. Live a life worth the ones who didn't make it." The words hit Rex like a hammer to the chest, his jaw clenched, his shoulders shaking. For the first time in years, tears slipped down his weathered face. They carved paths through the grime, the tattoos, the image he had built of indestructibility. The blood vultures lowered their heads, as though ashamed to even witness the scene. In that moment, they weren't bikers, criminals, or tough men. They were veterans, sons, brothers. Men staring at the embodiment of sacrifice they had forgotten how to honor. The store, once filled with the smell of motor oil and cheap liquor, now felt like sacred ground. And Elena Carter, Hawkeye, stood at the center, her scars bared, not as weakness, but as proof of a truth none of them could escape. Real strength isn't in the roar of engines or the crack of fists. It's in standing tall after the fire, in carrying scars with dignity, in refusing to break even when the world believes you already have. Rex remained on his knees, trembling, his voice breaking one final time. "You saved me then," he whispered. "And tonight, you saved me again." Elena closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a breath that trembled with the weight of memory. When she opened them again, clouded though they were, her gaze was steady, unyielding. This was no longer a gas station confrontation. It was a reckoning. The predator had bowed, and the blind Marine stood unbroken. The silence after Rex's confession stretched long, heavy, and almost unbearable. The air inside the gas station felt thick, charged with something none of the bikers could put into words. They had walked in expecting a game, expecting to humiliate someone weaker. Now they stood as men confronted by a truth they hadn't been prepared to face. The quiet clerk in front of them carried more courage in her scars than they had ever carried on their roaring engines. Elena's hand rested on Shadow's head. The dog's breathing was steady, his chest still tight with readiness, but his growl had softened to a hum, a warning left in reserve. She kept her fingers there, not for control, but for grounding, for herself. Her clouded eyes lifted, her chin angled slightly toward Rex still kneeling on the floor. Her voice, when it came, wasn't sharp or commanding. It was soft, yet filled with weight. "You think you owe me," she said quietly, "but you don't understand. After that explosion, after Fallujah, my war didn't end on the battlefield." Her words cut through the room, sharper than the tear of her shirt had been. Every man leaned closer without realizing it, as though drawn by a gravity she carried. "They pulled me out half dead," Elena continued. "7 surgeries. I learned to walk again. I learned to breathe without machines. I fought harder on hospital beds than I ever did behind a rifle. And when the bandages finally came off, when I thought I could start over..." She gestured vaguely toward her clouded eyes, unflinching. "I couldn't see. Not like before. My sight was gone. A Marine who couldn't track a target, who couldn't even read her own discharge papers." The younger bikers shifted uncomfortably, their bravado stripped clean. Some of them lowered their eyes to the floor, unable to hold her steady, blind gaze. "They didn't want to deal with me," Elena said, bitterness creeping into her tone. "Not the brass, not the politicians. They don't want broken heroes. They want posters, smiling faces for recruitment, clean stories. Not a woman blinded in a fire, scarred, half a soldier. So they buried me." Her words were steady, but the edge was sharp enough to draw blood. "They erased me from the record," she said. "Told the world Hawkeye was gone. Dead. It was easier to let a ghost live in legend than to let the truth walk among them. A truth that made them uncomfortable." Her fingers tightened briefly in Shadow's fur. The dog leaned into her hand, steady, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. "So I disappeared," Elena went on. "No medals, no speeches, no cameras, just me and Shadow. He lost his unit too. We were both discarded, both survivors without a place. So we made one, here, stocking shelves, mopping floors, working the night shift in a place nobody looks twice." Her voice dipped softer, almost tender, though her posture never bent. "I didn't need recognition. I didn't need the world to clap for me. I just wanted peace, a quiet life, to wake up without the smell of burning fuel in my lungs, to walk without the weight of men's screams in my ears. Peace, Rex. That's all I wanted." The room was so quiet that the hum of the refrigerators seemed deafening. Rex's shoulders shook, his head bowed lower. For years he had carried the guilt of believing she died for him. And now, to hear that she had survived, only to be erased by the very institution she bled for, was almost more than he could bear. The older biker swallowed hard, his throat working. His voice was low but steady when he spoke. "They should have honored you," he said, "not hidden you." Elena's expression didn't change. Her lips tightened, her jaw locked, but she didn't respond. The truth was she had stopped waiting for honor a long time ago. One of the younger men, the one who had been recording, slipped his phone into his pocket with trembling hands. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. Shame had replaced adrenaline, burning hot in his chest. Rex finally lifted his face, streaked with tears, his voice rough and broken. "And still, you saved me. Even when they erased you, even when the world turned its back, you saved me." Elena exhaled slowly, as though letting go of a weight she'd carried too long. Her words were measured, calm, final. "I didn't save you because you were special. I saved you because it was my job. Because Marines don't leave anyone behind. Not in the fire. Not in the smoke. Not in the dark." Her voice broke slightly softer now, the faintest tremor slipping through. "Even if the world leaves us behind afterward." Shadow pressed closer to her, sensing the crack in her voice, his muzzle brushing against her arm like a vow. The men in the store stood in silence, chastised children before a woman who had carried more pain than they could imagine, and still stood unbroken. The gas station had transformed from a stage for intimidation into a courtroom of truth, and the verdict was clear. Elena Carter had been forgotten by her country, but in this moment, in front of these men, she could no longer be erased. "I don't need medals," she said one final time, her words quiet but echoing like gunfire in the still air. "I just wanted peace." And for the first time in their lives, the blood vultures understood that peace was a battlefield all its own, one she had fought harder for than any of them ever could. The gas station smelled of sweat, oil, and something else, shame hanging thick in the air. Rex stayed on his knees, his arm marked with the fading impression of Shadow's bite. He had already said more than he thought himself capable of, but now his men began to move, slowly, hesitantly, as though compelled by something deeper than fear. One by one, the blood vultures, once wolves who prowled highways with arrogance, reached for the patches on their backs. The black leather vests, each marked with the snarling emblem of their gang, slid from their shoulders. None of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet scrape of leather being set down on the linoleum floor, the thud of boots shifting as they lowered their armor at Elena's feet. The first man, a younger rider with tattoos crawling up his neck, knelt slightly as he laid his vest down. His lips trembled, but no words came. Another followed, then another. Each vest landed softly against the growing pile, until the floor before her looked less like a show of power and more like an offering at an altar. Rex finally lifted his eyes, red-rimmed and wet, and his voice broke as he spoke into the silence. "This isn't an apology," he rasped, shaking his head as if the word wasn't enough. "This is respect. We were soldiers once. Some of us in uniform, some of us just fighting our own wars when we came back home. But somewhere along the way, we lost it. We lost who we were." He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "But you never stopped being a warrior." The words landed like stone, heavy and irrevocable. Elena stood still, Shadow pressed close against her leg. Her torn shirt revealed the tattoo that had silenced them all, the scar that bore witness to fire and loss. She didn't move to pick up the vests, didn't reach for them at all. Her hands stayed loose at her sides, her clouded eyes fixed forward. She hesitated. The weight of the moment pressed against her chest, threatening to unravel the fragile peace she had built for herself. These were not men she trusted. They had mocked her, torn at her, treated her like nothing more than prey. And yet, a soft pressure nudged her hand. Shadow's muzzle pressed gently into her palm, his eyes lifting to hers, calm and steady. It was a reminder as clear as any word. "You are not done yet." Elena's breath caught. For years she had convinced herself her fight was over, that survival was enough. But Shadow knew her better than anyone. He had been there when she screamed in hospital beds, when she stumbled through the dark, when the nightmares came like gunfire in the night. He knew she wasn't built to hide forever. The men before her waited. Tough men, scarred men, now standing bare without their colors, without their armor. For the first time, Elena saw them not as predators, but as something else. Broken veterans, men who had lost their compass and filled the void with noise and violence. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "You think I never stopped being a warrior," she said, "but you don't know the truth. I stopped the moment I walked away. I stopped the moment they told me I was too broken to keep fighting." Rex shook his head violently, his hand slapping against his thigh. "No, you don't get to say that. You don't get to erase what you did, what you still are. They might have tried to bury you, but they couldn't kill what you are." His words struck something inside her, a chord she had buried. Elena lowered her hand, resting it fully on Shadow's head. The dog's warmth spread into her palm, steadying her. She exhaled slowly, the faintest tremor in her breath. "I wanted peace," she said, almost to herself. "But maybe peace isn't hiding. Maybe peace is remembering who you are and choosing to fight a different way." The blood vultures stirred at her words, the men exchanging glances. They hadn't expected forgiveness. They hadn't even expected acknowledgement. But what she had given them was something rarer, a chance at redemption, not because they deserved it, but because she chose to see them as more than their sins. The older biker, the one who had recognized Fallujah, stepped forward, his voice rough. "Then let us fight with you, not against you, not the way we've been living. Let us stand for something again. You don't have to carry this alone." For a long moment, Elena said nothing. The hum of the coolers filled the space. The neon light flickered faintly outside. Then she nodded once, just barely, but enough. Shadow pressed closer, his tail giving a single slow wag as though he too understood. The blood vultures bowed their heads, the sound of leather settling on the floor still lingering in the air. They had come to intimidate, to humiliate, to remind the world they were predators. Instead, they had found something stronger than their rage. A woman who had faced the fire, lost everything, and still stood unbroken. And in her silence, they found their redemption. Word spread like wildfire. One moment, Hawkeye was a ghost buried in whispers. The next, she was alive, standing in a small-town gas station with her loyal K9 pressed against her leg. By morning, the cracked parking lot outside Carter's Fuel and Deli was filled with motorcycles, pickup trucks, and old sedans, plates from 3 states away. Veterans came quietly, some in faded uniforms, some in civilian clothes, all drawn by the same rumor. The woman who was left for dead in Fallujah still walks among us. They didn't come to gawk. They came to stand in silence, to see her with their own eyes, to place their hands briefly on Shadow's head as if touching a piece of living history. Some brought photographs of brothers who never made it home. Others simply stood at the edge of the lot, hats in hand, too overcome to speak. Elena remained inside, the blinds pulled halfway. She had not asked for this. She had built a life out of invisibility, and now the world had found her again. Shadow leaned against her thigh, sensing her unease. She rested a hand on his head, grounding herself against the storm gathering outside. Rex and the blood vultures had not left her side. Stripped of their leather, they stood more like a protective detail than a gang now, keeping the curious at bay. Their loyalty was clumsy, imperfect, but sincere. Rex's eyes never left Elena, haunted, reverent, still heavy with the debt he believed he owed. By the 3rd day, Elena realized hiding was no longer an option. Veterans kept arriving, some traveling hundreds of miles, not for spectacle but for hope. They wanted proof that broken did not mean finished, proof that scars could still carry weight. That evening, Elena sat at the counter, the phone in front of her like a weapon she wasn't sure she could lift. Shadow pressed his muzzle against her palm, as though urging her to take the step she'd been resisting. Her chest rose and fell, steadying. Then she picked up the receiver and dialed the number Colonel Monroe had left with Rex. The line clicked. Marine Corps Training Command, Colonel Monroe speaking. Her voice came out low but unwavering. This is Gunnery Sergeant Elena Carter. Call sign Hawkeye. I'll come back. The silence on the other end stretched. Then Monroe exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for years. Gunny, you don't know what this means. Elena's grip tightened on the phone. I'm not coming back to teach them how to kill, she said. Her voice sharpened, steel wrapped in sorrow. They already know enough about that. I'll teach them how to survive and how to come home. Shadow shifted, pressing against her as if sealing the vow. Outside, the crowd of veterans lingered in the fading light, the murmur of their voices carried by the wind. Some looked toward the door, waiting. Others stared at the horizon, as though already seeing a future shaped by the woman they once thought lost. Elena hung up the phone. The decision was made. She had been a ghost long enough. Now it was time to return, not to the battlefield, but to the living. Weeks later, the echo of boots on polished concrete filled a Marine Corps training hall. Rows of young recruits sat straight-backed, their eyes locked on the woman at the front. They had heard whispers of her before she ever stepped into the room. A ghost, a legend, a name spoken in reverence by veterans who had walked through fire and swore she was the one who carried them out. Now she stood before them, no longer a ghost, no longer hidden. Gunnery Sergeant Elena Carter, call sign Hawkeye. She gripped the podium with hands scarred and calloused, her clouded eyes facing the sea of fresh uniforms. At her side lay Shadow, faithful and calm, ears perked as though he too was listening. He had become more than her guide, he was her anchor witness, her proof that survival was possible even after the world tried to take everything. Her voice carried steady without hesitation. You see me blind, yet I'm still here. That means nothing can stop you, unless you let it. The recruits leaned forward, hanging on every word. Some had already seen combat in their imagination, painting glory into the unknown. Others carried quiet fear of what lay ahead. All of them listened to her, because she wasn't speaking from a manual or a polished speech. She was speaking from scars. In battle, Elena continued, you'll think the hardest fight is out there, against the enemy, against the chaos. But the truth is, the hardest fight comes later, when you're home, when the noise stops, and you're left alone with the memories. Her clouded eyes swept the room as though she could still see their faces, and somehow they felt seen. You think blindness broke me? You think 7 surgeries, the scars, the nights screaming into hospital sheets made me weak? Her hand tightened on the podium. Then she shook her head slowly. No, what almost broke me was forgetting who I was when the war ended. Letting the silence convince me I was finished. Letting peace feel like punishment. Don't make that mistake. Don't let the uniform be the only thing that tells you who you are. Shadow stirred at her feet, and Elena reached down to place her hand gently on his head. A smile ghosted across her lips. "This dog sees for me," she said, her voice softer now, threaded with something like hope. "But I will teach you how to see with your heart, because vision isn't in the eyes, it's in the will to keep going." For a moment, the hall was silent. Then one recruit in the front row nodded sharply, almost like he was saluting without raising his hand. Others followed with small motions, quiet affirmations that they understood. At the very back, a cluster of men sat straighter than the rest. No longer clad in black leather and patches, they wore plain dress uniforms borrowed from closets and trunks. Rex Dalton sat among them, shoulders squared, the mark of Shadow's bite still faint on his arm. Beside him, the former blood vultures looked nothing like the men who once swaggered into a gas station for cruelty. They sat as veterans now, heads bowed with respect. A brotherhood reborn, forged not in violence but in humility. When Elena's words faltered for a heartbeat, Rex's eyes filled. He whispered something meant only for himself, though the man beside him caught it. "She saved me twice, once in fire, once in shame." Elena drew in a slow breath, lifting her chin. "Some of you will leave this place and never face a bullet. Some of you will, and you'll come home carrying weight no one else can understand. But I promise you this, you are never alone, not in the fight, not in the silence, not when the world tries to make you believe you're forgotten." Her voice dropped, each word deliberate. "You are never alone, because ghosts don't abandon their own." Shadow barked once, sharp and clear, as if punctuating her vow. The recruits jumped slightly, then smiled, a ripple of relief moving through the hall. Elena smiled too, and this time it reached her eyes. She pressed her palm against Shadow's fur and let the warmth ground her. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't just surviving. She was teaching, guiding, becoming the light she once searched for. The story had begun with a torn shirt, a cruel laugh, and a truth ripped into daylight. But it ended here, in a hall filled with young Marines and reformed outlaws who had found their way back to honor. The blind Marine and her canine partner no longer stood in the shadows. They stood as a beacon, a living testament to resilience, a reminder that scars are not endings, they are beginnings. And in the silence after her final words, every recruit, every veteran in that hall, understood. Hawkeye's legacy wasn't about the battles she fought. It was about the courage to live after them and to teach others to do the same.